Let's try that again. Good evening, folks. Good to see you here, and we're trying to languish along here without Brother John this week. So I am the official substitute teacher this evening, and it reminds me of the days when we were in school, and whenever somebody came in with somebody we didn't know, an adult we didn't know, with a film strip projector or or something like that, we weren't going to get anything done that day. Y'all remember that, or is that just me? Okay. All right. Let's get right into our Bible study, and then we'll spend some time in prayer later. If you would, turn to Judges chapter 14, please. Judges chapter 14. We're going to talk about Samson tonight. And we'll start reading in verse 1, and we'll take this a little chunk at a time here and work our way through. So this is verse 1. I'm going to be reading from the New King James. That's just my personal choice. If you want to follow in that, if you don't have that with you, they're the ones in the pew are New King James. So here we go. Verse 1. Now Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. So he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife. Then his father and mother said to him, Is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren or among all my people that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she pleases me well. But his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. For at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. Now we're told here in verse 1 that Samson went down to Timnah, which is about a 4 or 5 mile journey. And this was not a spiritual pilgrimage he was on. He was just looking really for a party. And there he finds this young Philistine woman, and she apparently looked like party material. So he becomes infatuated with her, and in fact, it was kind of a case of lust at first sight. So he tells his parents to go get her for him. And look how he puts it in verse 2. He says, Get her for me. Who talks to their parents like that? Not supposed to. But his parents in verse 3 question what's going on here, and rightfully so. Because I can only imagine their shock at this, because I'm sure they'd be fine with him visiting the Philistine outpost there at Timnah with a possibility of maybe invading it, but certainly not to find a wife. That was definitely not acceptable. So, and understand why. I think most of you know that intermarriage with foreigners was something that was totally forbidden in Mosaic law. And if you want to look that up, it's in Exodus 34. We're not going to read it tonight. But there were few people groups in that part of the world that were hated as much as the Philistines. But Samson didn't want to listen to his parents, so his reasoning was no secret. He makes it very clear. He says, she pleases me well. Actually, we would say it this way. We'd say, she looks good to me. That's what he was saying. So Samson has no respect for his parents. He's kind of like an animal who has appetites that need to be fulfilled. You know, it's pretty much common knowledge that animals, they're looking for 3 things. They want food and they want sleep, and then they're looking for the mate of the day. And sometimes people get like that. You know, they can get that way. But right in the middle of Samson's pursuit of this, there's a statement in verse 4 that's kind of astonishing. His parents didn't know that this was actually from the Lord. And the Lord was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines. I think that's really interesting. So God is working behind the scenes here to accomplish his purpose, even to the extent of using the sinful desires of this man, this compromised man. And as far as we know, Samson was unaware of what God was up to on this occasion. He lived his life as though God was disconnected from his personal life. And for Samson, he would think of God as being a smiling, winking, white-haired old man sitting on a rocking chair. But God's about to get his attention. So just to kind of review so far before we move on, he's allowed himself to become infatuated with this woman who's an unbeliever, and he makes a deliberate decision to disobey God and follow the desires of the flesh. And he also cuts off his parents and hurts them. It was very hurtful, I'm sure, when he said those things to them. You know, parents, you understand that. You've been disappointed by your children at some point, I'm sure. And there have been situations where, they've cut you pretty deep. And it's frustrating because you raise your kids to do the right things. You raise them in the fear and admonition of the Lord. And then some of them, when they get older, they just decide to go off on a tangent and do the wrong things. And that is not what they've been taught. It's painful to see that, but it does happen because people have freedom of choice. But it's no fault of the parents most of the time. Now let's go on to verse 5. Verse 5. So Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother and came to the vineyards of Timnah. Now to his surprise, a young lion came roaring against him. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he tore the lion apart as one would have torn apart a young goat, though he had nothing in his hand. But he did not tell his father or mother what he had done. Then, and this is verse 7, then he went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. And after some time, when he returned to get her, he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, a swarm of bees and honey were in the carcass of the lion. He took some of it in his hands and went along, eating. When he came to his father and mother, he gave some to them, and they also ate. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion. So when the parents saw that Samson had his mind set on this, they decided to go with him to Timnah. And apparently they're walking along there, and they got to this point where Samson said, okay, Mom and Dad, you keep going straight on this road. I'm going to cut through this vineyard and see what's going on in there. And I'll meet you on the other side. So he takes a little detour, and he knew, of course, that this was wrong because Samson was a Nazirite, and when he took that Nazirite vow, he knew that he was not supposed to be around anything having to do with alcohol, even a vineyard. But apparently, violating his vow and disobeying God didn't matter that much to Samson. So while he's passing through the vineyard, imagine this, try to picture this in your mind. He's still looking for a party, I'm sure. He comes across this young lion who kind of jumps out in the path there to meet him. Now notice that we're told this is a young lion. It's not an old, worn out, half dead old thing, but no, this is a young, agile, strong, beautiful lion. King of beasts, you might say. And then verse 6 says that the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, giving him the power to kill the lion. The Hebrew word there that talks about coming upon him means to rush upon. And the picture is of the Spirit of God rushing upon Samson to give him the power to immediately defend himself against this lion. Wow, what an incredible moment that was for Samson. And I might add, by the way, there are times in all of our lives when we face a crisis, when we face a lion, if you will, and it's standing right in our path. And when those things happen, we become keenly aware that our human strength is not enough. And that's when God steps in. He stepped in for Samson, and he can step in for you. And interestingly enough, Samson didn't tell his parents about this at all. They were totally unaware of this event in his life. And we can understand that because sometimes we don't tell people about our lion, do we? When we have that thing that's in front of us, sometimes we keep it to ourselves. Well, Samson continues to pursue this woman, and that's totally disobedient. And in verse 7, we see that he continues to nurture this relationship, and he gets more and more attracted to her. And then sometime later on a return trip, he continues to disobey, because in verse 8, as he's walking along, he turns aside again to go down that path and look at the dead lion that he killed. And when he finds it, he sees that there's a beehive in there, and he scoops out some of the honey. And he later gave some of that honey to his parents, but I want you to notice that he didn't tell them that the honey was defiled. And why was it defiled? Because it came out of a dead body. And contact with the dead was a direct violation of his Nazirite vow, once again. But keep in mind that sometime before, he'd already, violated this vow by being actually in the vineyard, and now he violates it again by touching the dead animal. So obviously, this vow to God meant very little to Samson. He was living a life of disobedience, a life given over to fleshly passions. And he always seemed to have that problem in his life. Now let's go on to verse 10. So his father went down to the woman, and Samson gave a feast there, for young men used to do so. And it happened when they saw him that they brought 30 companions to be with him. I'll have more to say on that in a minute. And then verse 12, then Samson said to them, let me pose a riddle to you. If you can correctly solve and explain it to me within the 7 days of the feast, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. But if you cannot explain it to me, then you shall give me 30 linen garments, give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. And they said to him, pose your riddle, and that we may hear it. And here it is in verse 14. So he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. Now for 3 days they could not explain the riddle. Now in that section, I want to point out that verse 11 is the key to understanding this whole part of the chapter, because it tells us that Samson had no friends. You say, well, how do you know that? Because he didn't have any of his own men to stand with him at the wedding. So the bride's family provided 30 fake friends for him for this wedding. And the first thing he does is rather odd here. In fact, his character, or I guess I'd say his lack of it, is shown here in his attempt to confuse or cheat the wedding guests. And it says here that Samson's father had gone to see this woman, and all these arrangements had been made, and they were having this feast, big 7-day feast, by the way, and it's really more of a bachelor party is what we would probably call it. And at the end of that 7-day period, the groom would consummate the marriage by taking his bride. Again, all this partying, it was against his Nazirite vow. Apparently, Samson cared very little about his testimony. So he comes up with this riddle, and he turns it into a gamble, and he has all these people against him on this, so it's pretty good gamble, but they couldn't figure it out. There's no way they could possibly answer it because of the way he asked it. The riddle in verse 14 is very clever, and he says, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. That first line would be misleading, because they were what had they been doing since they got there? They were all eating. So they're kind of assuming that it's referring to them, okay? So that totally throws them off, and the second part of it, just makes no sense. They don't know what to do about it. So it was very frustrating. And we're told here that for 3 days they couldn't give the answer. Now all this took place because, why? Because Samson had no wise counsel around him. He didn't have any friends. His friends from home, for whatever reason, never showed up to be a part of this wedding. You know, when you walk away from friends, you lose a lot. And when you walk away from godly friends, you could lose everything. Because a lot of times they keep us on track, don't they? Well, let's go to verse 15. But it came to pass on the seventh day that they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband that he may explain the riddle to us, or else we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us in order to take what is ours? Is that not so? Then Samson's wife wept on him and said, you only hate me. You do not love me. You have posed a riddle to the sons of my people, but you have not explained it to me. And he said to her, look, I have not explained it to my father or my mother, so should I explain it to you? Now she had wept on him the 7 days while their feast lasted. And it happened on the seventh day that he told her because she pressed him so much. Then she explained the riddle to the sons of her people. So the men of the city said to him on the seventh day before the sun went down, what is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion? And he said to them, one of the most amazing answers in Scripture to any kind of a question. He says, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. Oh, this guy is off to a bad start with this woman. Now, this is the first time we hear her voice, so to speak. And ladies, it's not a lofty moment for your kind, unfortunately. And then his callous response is kind of revealing, where he says, I haven't even explained it to my father or mother. So why would I bother telling you? So here's what's happening. She is engaged to a man who has no desire for her outside of the bedroom. That's what we're seeing here. But there's an interesting truth here that I want you to see. She's willing to deceive and betray her husband to save her parents. And he saw nothing wrong in being more attached to his parents than his wife. The parents really figure into this story. Now, these are the same parents that Samson ignored, if you recall, at the beginning. This guy was a mess. Anyway, her nagging was relentless, and finally on the seventh day, motivated by just a desire for peace, he finally told her. And in turn, she explained it to her people. Notice that I think it's funny that they waited until the evening of the seventh day before they told him. He thought he had it made, and they showed up at the very last second and snatched victory from Samson at the last minute. And they answer by asking two rhetorical questions. And the way they say this is kind of like, is almost an obvious deduction. Like they're saying, hey, what's sweeter than honey? What's stronger than a lion? We knew it all the time. But apparently they did not know, none of the people in the story knew the source of the honey or the attack of the lion. And it was a secret that Samson had kept to himself. So I guess what I'm saying is the folks knew the answer to the riddle, but they did not know how the story happened. So it's kind of like a kid in school, that cheats on a math test. They might get the answers right, but they can't do the work, to show how they did it. And that's exactly what we have here with these people. Well, Samson realized he'd been betrayed by this woman. And I have to say a word here about the word heifer. There are some scholars that say that it was a common reference to a woman in those days. And I have to disagree with that. I'm sorry, I don't care what kind of culture you live in, but I can't think of any place where it would be acceptable to refer to your wife as a cow or your future wife. And then the second part of his quote there, where he talks about plowing with her, there's a sexual connotation there. What he's saying is, she's a cow, and some of you guys have probably had your way with her, and that's how you know about this. Wow, I don't even know what to say about that. So not only is Samson, he's a compromised man, but he's also kind of a jerk. And by the way, we see once again the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson here, empowering him to kill, and this is later on, and strip the clothing and armament from 30 men in Ashkelon. In order to do that, how do you kill 30 men? What do you have to touch in order to kill 30 people? You're going to have to touch some dead bodies probably. And there's that Nazirite vow being broken once again. And the way this thing ends up, rather than consummate the marriage with this woman that he had to have, he skulked around and pouted and went home to his mother. And she ended up marrying the best man. Now, let's just review. Samson's character was exposed in the conflicts of his life. He pursued the wrong person, this woman, in defiance of his God and his parents. He repeatedly violated his Nazirite vow in defiance of God's command. He tried to cheat the wedding guests with his riddle, and he insulted and embarrassed his fiancée. He used his abilities to kill his enemies for all the wrong reasons, and he abandoned his fiancée to public ridicule. Samson failed. In fact, let me tell you what kind of person he was, and if you forget everything else tonight, maybe you'll hang on to this. Samson was a man of faith, but he was not a faithful man. And I'm referring to God here. He was not faithful to God. He was a man of faith, but he was not a faithful man. And we've seen that displayed in this part of his story. There are a whole series of bad choices on the part of Samson just in this one chapter. And he continued that throughout his life, unfortunately. So the question is, what can we learn from this evening? Well, I think there are a couple things. First of all, we need to take our commitments to God seriously, more seriously than Samson did. He never found his potential because he didn't take his vow seriously. You know, as far as we know, Samson never prayed at any other time. At least we have no biblical record of him praying except when he was chained to the pillars at the end of his life. And I hope that doesn't describe you. Keep that communication open with the Lord. So the first thing is take your commitment seriously. The second thing I would say is that we need to stick close to godly friends. If you don't have a close friend that is a follower of Christ, a serious follower of Christ, you need to look for that and try to find that, because what happens is there becomes a void in our life that can be filled by people who are not related to Christianity at all, ungodly people. And then the third thing I would say is that we need to make careful choices that are led by God. You know, if Samson had ever taken a moment to pray in this whole situation, he would have been a lot better off because he would have gone a different path. So that's the story of Samson and the lion. And I hope you'll remember some of that this evening. Now let's